Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hoping you're well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Barbenheimer once again at the top with the number 1 and 2 punch, dropping out the Meg 2, which dropped all the way down to the number 4 spots, and TMNT Mutant Mayhem climbed up to the number 3 spot. Let's just say right now, though, that when it comes to the number 3 and 4 movies this weekend, it is not looking all that great for either movie. Right now, they are not making nearly as much money as they would need in order to be anywhere close to profitability. The Meg 2, of course, has the biggest problem being that almost about half of its entire box office that it's made so far is coming just from one country, that being China, where they get the worst return on investment as having a Western Hollywood studio there, but also because it is a Western film release. And even though the fact that you do have a Chinese company there, guess what? When it comes to the money made by any movie in that country, it's going to be going to the CCP at the end of the day when it comes to the vast majority of any profits that could possibly be made. All of that while the brand new Universal flick, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, is not doing much of anything, coming in the number 5 spot in its opening weekend, making a paltry $6.5 million. So we'll go ahead and talk about that and a plethora of other films as well. Before going any further, please make sure you smash that like button, loud that fire button, Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time your video or live stream goes live on the channel. So starting off first with Barbie, we have Barbie making another $33.7 million, only a 36% drop from last weekend, so a very strong hold. What's even most impressive is that even after 4 weeks of release, there's not really been any major changes to its theatrical count. It has over 4,000 screens still. That is not something that you see very much in today's box office market. You have a lot of films doing very well in the first couple weeks. You have some films that are able to stretch it out a little bit further. Films like Super Mario Brothers, films like Top Gun Maverick last year. Well, this year it is turning out to be films like Barbie and Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, I think, is the more surprising of the two, simply because it is a 3-hour movie and a 3-hour drama at that. Sure, that's going to bring out some of the more adult audiences, but also typically not really seen as some of the bigger money makers with movies like that, especially with that kind of runtime. But with all that being said, Barbenheimer is still clearly at the top. What's always interesting about Barbenheimer is how similar they are in their percentage drop-offs, right? You are seeing them be almost within 1 or 2 percentage points every single week. This week, 36% drop for Barbie, only a 35% drop for Oppenheimer, so very impressive. Another $18.8 million being added for Oppenheimer from Universal. What's also interesting is that right now Barbie's at $526 million domestic and Oppenheimer is at $264 million domestic, and I think both films have a lot of ground still left to track, especially with very little film set to be released. In fact, you could end up seeing Blue Beetle set to come out this coming week, probably end up getting behind even a film like Barbie. I think that it will end up beating a movie like Oppenheimer. I think it's projected to get around the $20 million domestic range. So if it performs better than that, then obviously we're talking about a different scenario. But you have a good chance for Barbie to once again repeat at the number 1 spot next weekend, which again is insane in hindsight and insane in context, but hey, it is exactly what it is right now. Let's go ahead and talk about TMNT Mutant Mayhem from Paramount. Even though the film only dropped 44%, again, percentage-wise, that's not bad. It even added an extra 92 theaters. Things are seemingly going pretty well for it. The fact still remains that this movie is just not making much anywhere else for it to really be looking like any kind of winner, right? So all the numbers and all the percentages that we're looking at would indicate, or would seem to indicate, it must be doing okay. It must be doing at least healthily. But when you're actually looking at the raw totals and raw numbers, and you're understanding this within a historical framework of where most movies that hit these numbers in their initial 2 weeks end up, this movie is likely going to end up actually being a box office flop. We still have a lot of ground still left to cover with this movie, because we all know that when it comes to movies like this, it sometimes can, make more and more over time. Right now, I don't think we're seeing exactly the same kind of numbers that we saw for a film like Elemental, which made a lot extra money, a lot more money down the stretch, especially internationally. So this film maybe has some of those extra countries yet it has not to release in yet that might be able to bring in some of those extra dollars. But based on the numbers that we're seeing right now, it's actually not looking all that great for it, even though the percentage hold has actually been pretty strong. Same can actually be said for the Meg 2, with the only difference really being that it's making the vast majority of its money in the wrong country. The Meg 2 only making $12.7 million, so 58% drop. Yes, that's the highest drop that we're looking at in these top 4 movies, but at the end of the day, 58% for a typical film, especially a $100+ million film's budget, that's actually not bad. We've seen much worse drop-offs than that. But the problem that this movie has is it needs to be making all the money it's making in China here if it was making that money here, this film was over $100 million domestic right now, guess what? This film would be in a much healthier position. But because half of its entire box office, this film has made about $250 million worldwide now, when about half of that money is coming from one country, and it's also the worst return on investment for studios, that is not a good thing at all. So even though right now my charting has the film likely breaking even, likely making even a little bit of profit, because of how the money is working and because of where the movie is making money, it probably will still end up being a box office flop. And again, can't really say I'm all that surprised. The first Meg was fun, but I did not want a sequel, and it sounds like a lot of other people felt in a very similar way. Coming in the number 5 spot is the brand new release this week of The Last Voyage of the Demeter, making $6.5 million. That's just not good. The budget for the film is not nearly as high as one would think. It's only $45 million. That's about what I thought it was going to have cost. A movie like this probably should have cost a lot less. Had they instead decided to use all practical effects for some of the Dracula stuff, I think that probably would have been able to cut their cost down even that much more, even though the CGI is not nearly as prominent as what the trailers might seem it to be. I didn't even know that there was a lot of practical effects, but the people who have seen it have said, hey, there are several moments in the movie that they actually decide to go practical, and, it actually looks pretty good. If they could only return to that, they could just, again, cut a film's budget, a film like this, where they should only be spending maybe $20 million tops, and if they were, they would be in a better situation. Even so, $6.5 million is just not going to cut it. We don't have any numbers coming from anywhere else at this point as of recording of this video, so for all I know, it might be making some money elsewhere, but if a movie like this is only making $6.5 million domestic, it's not likely going to be making a whole lot elsewhere, just based off of the current metrics and numbers that we have in front of us. Haunted Mansion from Disney dropped another 39%, so this film also, after 3 weeks, is pretty much being abandoned by Disney in a lot of ways. The fact that it only dropped 39%, and yet it was dropped from 880 screens, is slightly impressive. However, it's also clear that Disney does not have a lot of confidence in this movie, and based on the numbers, they really shouldn't. The film's only made $52 million so far after 3 weeks of its release, and as I projected last weekend, it is likely going to be yet another massive box office flop for Disney. They just keep on accruing those flops as the days go by. Number 7 film is Talk to Me from A24, dropping another 19%, so again, very, very strong holds for this movie. Made $31.3 million because this film only cost around $4.5 million or so. This movie is in a good position. It's going to be continuing to add to its overall profits. Sound of Freedom at number 8. So this film's still in the top 10. Despite it continuing to get lambasted in the media with completely false articles about being quote-unquote QAnon adjacent and other nonsense like that, when the movie is the only thing the movie is doing is telling a true story about how there are indeed kids that are being maltreated, and that is, I think, probably the best way, the kindest way to explain it, because it's that much worse in reality. So I think that the fact that you do have people continuing to go after this film, including even the comment section of my own videos, it's like, bro, if you can't even get on board with the movie calling out, exposing, and calling for change in regards to trying to protect children in our world, I can't help you at that point if you don't see how you're on the wrong side of this. But this film only dropping 36% is starting to lose theaters, so it's definitely losing the momentum that it had for quite a bit. But hey, this film was rocking it for a good 3-4 weeks, doing very, very strong numbers, and it's still hanging around too. So hey, kudos to Angel Studios. They've made, again, all the money that they really ever could hope to make from this movie domestically, going to be having further international releases, so it's going to continue to add to its overall money. But we're looking at a possibility still of a domestic end somewhere around $200 million or so, and especially over that when you added any international numbers they actually make. The number 9 spot goes once again to Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, dropping from the number 7 to the number 9 spot, making another $4.6 million. As you can see, its per theater ratio is actually now starting to look a little bit better than even Sound of Freedom. 29% after dropping 287 screens. As I said, this film's legs are definitely a lot better than what anyone could have expected it to be, based on how poor the initial numbers actually were. It's still not going to be enough for it to be able to make its money back, but the fact that it is still hanging around the way that it is domestically, and even more so internationally, I think it actually was able to add from last week to this week another $25 million. It's slowing down, and it's definitely not going to be able to make its money back, but, it's doing well enough to where its losses are going to not be nearly as high as initially we had thought. And the only film after that in the number 10 spot is Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny at $899,000, 7 weeks of its release. Again, being abandoned by Disney. Massive flop, probably the biggest flop of of all, if not the biggest flop of all time, one of the biggest flops of all time, or at the very least of the modern era. Going into the actual individual releases for Barbie at $1.1 billion, this film, as you can see, is well on its way, not just to 1.2, but likely 1.3 plus. I think the range of somewhere between 1.3 and 1.6 million when everything is said and done is very likely. If we actually compare this movie to a couple of other billion-dollar films, Super Mario Brothers movie, which came out in April of this year, ended around $1.358 billion, and Top Gun Maverick from last year ended around $1.478 billion. Now, what's interesting is when you look at both the domestic and international. As of right now, the domestic numbers for Barbie are looking really, really good, right? $526 million as of right now. This film is going to pass Super Mario Brothers within the next week. So very, very impressive numbers there, and it will be the highest domestic film of this year. So that's, again, very impressive. We're looking at probably north of $600 million. The question is, how much past 600 domestic does it actually make? Does it get to the 718 domestic of Top Gun Maverick? Remember, Top Gun Maverick actually did better than the 10 weeks that even the numbers tracks. Typically, most films, by 10 weeks of release, you start to get into the one, under $1 million a day. It starts to really just, again, it starts to go on its way out. And that is something that you might actually end up seeing with a movie like Barbie based on currently where it is. And so we'll go ahead and look at the day-to-day comparison. The other number I do want to point to internationally, though, before going into the domestic comparisons, is the fact that Barbie's at 657 right now internationally. So I think the question not only is going to be, does it get, or how close does it get to Top Gun Maverick? Does it pass that mark domestically? And then also, is it going to have enough gas right now to match the international numbers of Super Mario or even of Top Gun Maverick? I think it has a better chance of continuing its domination domestically than internationally. Again, it's still going to be doing well in both, but I think that the chasm between each of those is definitely a lot smaller in the domestic than in the international, but it's going to be interesting to watch those numbers as they continue to go. As you can see, right, there are many, many days in which you have Barbie beating out the daily numbers for both Super Mario and Top Gun Maverick. So if you actually compare this, right, to the fourth Friday, Maverick had the edge with $11 million. It also had the edge over Barbie with $15 million. However, Super Mario had $18 million, $17 million Sunday versus $10 million Sunday for Barbie. So again, it's going to be interesting to see from this point forward how well does the Barbie film match up to these other two, right? Because when you look at Mario, it was getting $2-3 million a day at the point of its fourth week, whereas Maverick was getting $7.5-8 million a day. So is it going to be closer to the Super Mario money, or is it going to be closer to the domestic, for the domestic for Top Gun Maverick? If it's closer to Maverick, but it's not as high or is barely underneath, then it might actually have a chance of catching up. But if it's going to be even just a couple million underneath it, but higher than Super Mario, that will show us why, one, it's going to easily pass the Super Mario domestic box office, but also, two, why it will probably end somewhere between Top Gun Maverick's numbers domestic and that of Super Mario Brothers. It'll be interesting to watch because it is, again, it has a lot of gas in the tank. It's not nearly as high, again, as especially Maverick was at this point in its weekend numbers. We obviously know the daily numbers were very, very strong for Maverick down the line as well, but this will be an interesting battle to continue to follow, right? Because if you just take the as of today numbers, $526 million is the current number for Barbie. At the same point of release, it was only $490 for the Super Mario Brothers movie, and it was only $466 million for the Top Gun Maverick film. So this is the reason why you have a good chance of having a massive domestic juggernaut. It's already a juggernaut on its hands, but could be even higher as the days continue to go by. So again, we'll be following that, and it'll be interesting to see whether it has a similar 10-week run as Maverick, or if it sees somewhat of a similar run as that of Mario, where, hey, this had a typical release where by the 10th week of release, it was in the hundreds of thousands range, whereas, again, Top Gun Maverick was at 655 by the end of 10 weeks. So just so we had to show you how crazy the domestic numbers were for Top Gun Maverick last year. I don't think we're seeing that yet, but this week I think will be a very good sign, because this is when you start to see Mario drop off a bit, but you also see Maverick continue to hold very, very strong. So either way, it's going to be a huge win for Barbie, but for anyone who follows box office, this kind of stuff is, of course, fascinating to watch. When it comes to Oppenheimer, $650 million worldwide. Very, very impressive numbers there for this 3-hour drama. Kudos to them for being able to take advantage of the the Barbenheimer effect, I should say. TMNT, only $94.6 million so far worldwide, so not even breaking $100 million. This is the reason why I think that the film might be in a little bit of trouble, because based on the numbers that we have right now, this is not going to be enough to hit the break-even point, and that's even looking at a more conservative estimate for what the film actually needs to make. Right now, it's at 1.4 times its budget. Again, my break-even is around 2.5 times. Others might be closer to 3 times the budget. But really, the big question is going to be, is this film going to have a lot of releases left in other countries? We can go ahead and try to get an idea right now. It is the 13th, so it still needs to be released in Argentina. It still needs to be released in Brazil, in Italy, in Japan. So there might be some who say, just wait until Japan. We all know, though, just like we've seen with Super Mario Brothers, waiting on Japan is not always going to be a guarantee of having, the biggest box office of all time necessarily. Obviously, Mario did very well, $100 million. So, when you look at the exchange rate, around $100 million in Japan, it made even after a delayed release. But I don't think you're going to probably see the same kinds of numbers. Mario, clearly a much bigger IP there than TMNT, but it'll be interesting nonetheless. It's open pretty much everywhere else. South Korea, again, not a guaranteed of massive money there. Spain, it's yet to release, and it's pretty much released everywhere else. So again, you definitely still have some countries that are on the table. So we could end up seeing a down the road number that ends up being better than what the initial estimates are. But it's not looking like it's going to be a massive moneymaker no matter which way it ends up going. The Meg 2, as I said, has a huge China problem. $256 million worldwide. Go ahead and just look at the domestic versus international number, though. 54 million domestic versus 202 international. They have not updated yet on the numbers. They're charting here. Again, some people always wonder, how is it that they have the 202, but then it doesn't add up in these overall categories? The reason why is because they get the report coming out right from the different sources that collect this data. And so they get that initial total number that's being reported, and that's what they enter in. And then over the course of the next few days, when they get the individual reports of how much it made per country, they update their other chart. And so it'll be interesting to see exactly how much it's made so far. But again, the fact that in China, as of the last time they updated it, it was at $70 million. You're looking at this movie getting well north of $100 million in China alone, and that takes up what? Half of the entire box office. So that's why it might look okay on paper. It might even be tracking to end around the amount of money it would need to break even. But it's because of how much money it's making in China versus anywhere else. It's not looking like it'll be a good, it's not going to be a good time for that studio. It's not going to be a good time. They're not going to really make any money off of this movie. Probably will end up having a financial loss there. As I said, again, Warner Brothers is double teaming this with another Chinese company. So it's just, again, not looking good at all for that. The Last Voyage of the Demeter at $6.5 million, also not looking that great either. We're just getting those domestic numbers in. Apparently the film is taking a lot of advantages of the story, is really just making a lot of things up, making up characters that don't actually exist, changing the nature of certain characters, things that we always hate in our, quote, modern retellings of classic stories. And this is such a really cool story that you could actually turn into a very creepy, well-made movie. It's just unfortunate that they decided to do the things that they did. As I said, I have not seen this movie yet, but a lot of people who I trust have, and their criticisms to me sound like they are well warranted as such. So Last Voyage of the Demeter only costing $45 million, not making really anything. And let's see if there's even anything on the as far as international releases are concerned, if there's anything else on the docket. As of right now, it's looking like it will get an Argentina release on the 24th. It will get a Germany release a little bit later, Mexico on the 24th, New Zealand, Spain, it still needs to be released in, and the United Kingdom. I just don't think you're going to really see a whole lot of money. Again, nothing currently being reported from any of the countries that it has released in, which to me tells me a lot about how little interest people have in this movie. So it'll be interesting to watch if those numbers do update and how much they are. But typically, if you have a movie that at this point of time, right now, 2 p.m. on Sunday Eastern time, has not updated with international numbers, usually that means there's not a whole lot of money to report. So again, if that changes, we'll of course mention it next week, but we have to look at it as it currently is. Haunted Mansion is on the low end even of the numbers projections as far as where most films do historically, $75 million. This film being abandoned by Disney in many ways. If you look at the theaters, this film still a box office flop. Talk to Me is a film, cost very little money to make, and hey, is once again going to be a moneymaker for A24. Sound of Freedom, $172 million, continuing to add to its overall profits. Very, very good. And again, sad that it got so much hatred towards it. Imagine if the media decided instead to tell the story, to actually spread the message. Imagine how many more people would go to see it. I shudder to think about how many people chose not to go see the movie because of people like Tony, because of people in the media who lied and said it was QAnon conspiracy, who said it was QAnon adjacent, who said that it was not true. All of these other things, even calling it faith-based, right, when it's clearly not a faith-based movie, is something that took people away that otherwise would have gone to see it. I would love to know at some point how much, like if there was ever a way to find out, kind of how, after the election we found out, oh, had people known this, would you still have voted for this person? It'd be kind of cool to find out exactly how many people, would have gone to see this film, would have been typically drawn to this kind of movie, but were kind of pushed away because of the things that they were told about it. Again, not necessarily that would be cool per se, but it would be interesting nonetheless to see if the numbers like that could actually be found. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, it breaks my heart that this movie is not doing well. This movie is phenomenal. This movie is one of the best films to come out this year, and I just honestly think they completely screwed up their release. They decided on the wrong tactic. I understand where they were coming from. They wanted to get more time in the IMAX screens because of Oppenheimer taking over only about a week after their release. But to me, they should have said, you know what? Let's go ahead, take a gamble. Let's go ahead and release this up against Dial of Destiny. I think that would have been a huge win. I think that would have been a huge way for them to take advantage of the extra time at the box office with no competition up until Barbenheimer. But obviously, hindsight is 2020. And it's again very sad to see. It is doing better than what anyone else would have expected for most movies that do the kind of numbers that this film is doing. Again, you typically would not be seeing the kind of legs that this is having domestically and internationally, and that's kind of the nature of most Mission Impossible movies, but it's definitely not having that kind of long-term, long-stretch magic that other films have seen to the same level, to the same degree. It's still there, but because it's so much lower, it's not going to be enough to make up for the massive budget that got ballooned a lot because of COVID. Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny, $370 million, still as big of a flop as Mission Impossible might end up being, and again, I say might because how much money does it get when they sell the international streaming rights to other countries? Since Paramount Plus is not an international in every single country, it's going to make some money from that. It's going to make some money from 4K. Again, none of this is going to be enough to be able to make up for its total losses, but it definitely will be enough to make sure that Indiana Jones is the biggest flop of this year. Again, $290 million was the cost of Mission Impossible. This movie is projected to have cost $300 million, but there's many smart people, in fact, who say, I think it's probably closer to 400 plus million. We'll find out next year when those tax returns from the UK come in. And then lastly, we have Elemental at 443. Some people have been pointing out saying, oh, it's adding so much money every single week internationally. It's slowing down. And as I mentioned then, it's impressive. This film had great legs. Disney put out a press release too to try to argue that somehow this movie was very successful. It's still not. This film still lost money. And even on a more conservative side of things, you're still looking at a $30 to $40 million loss, which means that if you use a more typical, modern strategy, you're looking at north of that, maybe even close to $100 million of losses. So we can say two things are true at once. This film did much better down the stretch, had very, very strong legs, but we can also say it was not enough for it to actually make its money back. Going to the charting, because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews, we have first The Last Voyage of the Demeter. $6.5 million puts the current film at $63.6 million in the red. And remember, it's because studios do not get 100% of their box office. They have to split that with theaters. So again, by the end of the run, it's typically about a 60-40 split. There's differences that we have in this as well with other channels and other people. Sometimes they'll say it's closer to 50-50. And again, ultimately, it doesn't really matter for this case because you're still looking at the film being at a loss. At $45 million of a budget, it only needs to make $112.5 million to break even. But hopefully anyone with even a slight capacity for math can see a 6.5 start to a $112.5 million goal, and that's a more conservative endpoint that it would need. It's not looking good. And I can't imagine the international is going to come in a huge way for that movie. But again, we have been surprised before, and if I'm wrong, I of course will admit it, but we'll have to wait and actually see. The Meg 2 at $256 million now. After first 2 weeks, we can now make some projections. So at $256, we can project the film will make somewhere between $367 and $500 million worldwide. At a $129 million budget, the film needs to make around $322.5 million to break even. Now remember that not only is using a 2.5 multiplier and not a 3, but it's also taking into account what you typically would be getting from international, right? So a typical release that's making a lot of money domestically, that's making maybe as much or a little bit more internationally, would see those kinds of numbers. When it comes to this film, though, because 50% of its box office is coming not just from international, but coming from one country in China, where you get the worst returns on that money. Again, that means that the film, even though right now, on paper, for a usual movie of this caliber, would be making 26 to 114 million in profit. So right now, again, if this was any other film and it had a different type of release, so if it was making this kind of money domestic and making only a few million in China, for instance, we would be having a whole different discussion. We'd say, hey, this film is well on its way to making profit. But because of that China factor, even though, again, a typical release would make money, that China takes away any chance of that. That means the chance of the film making money is almost none. I mean, if someone wants to try to argue that, well, hey, it's co-produced by Chinese companies, so that means that because of that, they're not going to have the same, rules as far as how they split revenue. That's not necessarily true, because remember, all that the Chinese Communist Party cares about is getting money. And so especially when it comes to those Western releases, the only reason why is that 25-75% split is because the Western companies are not going to take anything less than that. I mean, if you have a Chinese local release, guess where all those profits are going? Yes, it's going back to the Chinese business, but who owns the Chinese business? It's communism. So therefore, it goes back into the party directly. So again, you're talking about money that's being made, whatever's split between those studios. Again, 100% of it's going to be going from that Chinese company is going to be going back to the Communist Party, whereas you still have that 25-75% split for whatever half or for whatever part the Warner Brothers gets from that deal. So it's still not going to be good. So we're looking at probably still a financial loss for the film, and that's if it gets to this point. And because of the China numbers, we just cannot actually confirm that will actually happen. We also have the second weekend numbers for TMNT, Mutant Mayhem. Based on a $94 million second weekend, we're projecting the film to make somewhere between $135 and $189 million. Again, the break-even point is $175 million off a $70 million budget. Again, other people might have it at 3 times the budget, which would be higher than that, of course. But that means that I'm projecting the film, based on these numbers, to make somewhere between $8.6 million at best if it doubles what it's made so far. So if it makes another roughly $100 million in the next several weeks that it is out, is a best case scenario historically, or it's going to lose around $23 million in a worst case scenario. Right now, what we're seeing is we are seeing numbers. Let's go ahead and go back to the chart. Again, it dropped about 44%. So we're seeing a drop in the 40s. The question is going to be, does it continue drops like that, or does it start to drop off a little bit more heavily? And also, what are the kind of drop-offs that we're going to see internationally? And so because of that, we might end up seeing, if it continues that trend, the number gets somewhere between that $8 and $7 million mark. But again, it's not going to be nearly enough to really justify its own existence, or at the very least to justify a sequel, unless they are seeing an increase in product sales, unless they are seeing an increase in merchandising sales, for instance. Then there's not going to be a whole lot there based on the numbers that we're seeing right now to put into production any future Seth Rogen produced TMNT movies. So again, that's obviously a whole other factor. We don't cover that here on this channel because we focus on the box office, and just based on box office alone, it's not looking all that great for that film. Talk to me. $34 million means it's around $14 million in the black, so continuing to add to its profits. So it's going to make money, but again, not going to be the biggest money maker of all time. But that percentage of how much they spent versus how much they get is still going to be very impressive. Haunted Mansion at $75 million is still 179 in the red. As you can see, its drops are definitely not looking very, very good. I had originally projected it to lose somewhere between 173 and 153, so it's not looking like it's going to be a worst case scenario. It's definitely not looking like it's going to be a best case scenario, though. And so again, we will have to wait and see by the end of its run. Barbie at $1.183 billion, getting close to $500 million net gain. Right now, it's not looking like a chart breaker per se, so it's looking like it'll probably end in the range that I originally had for this movie, which was 1.1 to 1.5 billion. And in either, it most likely it will probably get closer to that 1.5 than anything else. We'll continue to track that, but right now it's looking, again, like it's performing as well as what we would originally have thought it to be. Oppenheimer, $650 million, is actually performing even a bit better, right, in comparison to its first 2 weeks of release, right? That's what these numbers here mean. 65% means right now it's made the first 2 weeks account for 65% of Barbie's box office, 62% of, Oppenheimer's box office. So still very impressive gains nonetheless. So we're probably seeing north of 300 plus million in net gains for Oppenheimer, and well north of 550, maybe even 600 million in net gain profit from Barbie. And so very good news there for Warner Brothers. They needed a win, but here is the fun fact here. They're going to have to split those revenues. They're going to have to split those profits with Mattel. So let's say it gets $600 million. Let's say there's a 50-50 split. That seems to make the most sense. That means they get $300 million in net profit. Guess how much money they likely lost on a film called The Flash? That's right. They're looking at almost $200+ million. So yeah, and that's just The Flash alone. That's not even including the other flops and not even counting the upcoming likely flop in the Blue Beetle movie. So yeah, it's looking good for Warner Brothers, but again, you're talking about putting a Band-Aid on a giant gaping wound at this point. It's going to help, but it's not going to be nearly as much as they would actually need. Mission Impossible, as I mentioned, 121 million in the red right now. So it's, again, looking like it's performing like most films would be performing at this point, but it's still also a far cry from that minimum 725 million break-even point. So again, sad that it's seeing that. I wish the film was performing a little bit better. If it was getting closer even to, right, that break-even point, small amount of profit, we could definitely start to point to, hey, making that extra money on streaming sales, that extra money on 4Ks, but it's not looking like it's going to get even to that point. So again, very, very sad for a great film like that. Sound of Freedom at 81 million in profits. Again, very impressive. Insidious 5 continuing to add to its profits as well. And Dial of Destiny, as I mentioned, if you look at the overall budget for this movie as being likely the $400 million it cost, again, right now the projections early on were $300 million, but we did get some reports that some were saying, hey, we're thinking it could be closer to 400, especially after we got the fact that Doctor Strange 2 cost $100 million more than what the estimates were. Yeah, you could see this film right now, $377 million in the red. Do not be surprised if you find out down the road the film costs even more than that $400 million, meaning that you might get closer to $400 million in financial losses for Disney. Disney is in a lot of trouble this year. They only have one film that made any money for them, and that was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And even on a more conservative estimate, that's $100 million in net gain profits. Some would have it as a lot less than that, as being closer to break even. But hey, that's not going to make up for that $400 million loss in Indiana Jones, let alone the other films that they have yet to come out this year. The Marvels will be interesting. Will the Marvels show and prove that the MCU is indeed dead and done? We'll have to wait and see. It's clear that they're trying to shift their marketing to try to appeal to the Barbie demographic. I don't know if that's going to show up, right? Barbie is a very specific demographic. The kind of movie it is, right, with radical third wave, fourth wave feminism is going to appeal to that Gen Y, Gen Z. But will superhero women actually appeal? It's the numbers don't really seem to indicate that that's going to be the case. You go back to Ghostbusters 2016. What is Ghostbusters? Primarily a male, a male demographic, and guess what? No one showed up for it. If you look at even a film like Captain Marvel, guess what? It made $1 billion because you had a lot of men still highly invested in the MCU, and that was the last film to come out before Endgame. So there was a lot of thought of that having a lot of stakes to it and helping to give those last bits of preparation for it as well. So it'll be interesting to find out where that movie falls. But these are the numbers as they currently stand. What are y'all's thoughts? Do you think Last Voyage of the Demeter is going to do bonkers numbers in other countries that is not yet released in? Are we missing numbers here? Let me know in the comments section down below. Also, your thoughts on the Meg 2, TMNT, and all that good stuff. Anyway, let me know. Have a wonderful day. Smash that like button, light the fire button, honestly, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a blessed Sunday. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my members at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, starting off first with my members over on Patreon: Father Luca Illick, Heimir Irie Hymason, Garrett Searles, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Chat Reviews, check out his YouTube channel by the same name, Laura, the Monomator General's Story, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name as well. To my Subscribe Star peeps, Zion Voders, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Fast Reaction, The R, Mr. Roy, J-Rod, The Beer Guru, and the K-Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And lastly, to my locals members, Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, and Robert Barnes, the amazing lawyer. So thank you all very much for being my supporters at the Keep It the Bifrost level and above. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, go ahead and check out that top link in the video description below to find out ways to sign up to support the channel and to be able to get access to things like the shoutouts, but also to giveaways. I have an exclusive giveaways channel on my Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff, and also access to an exclusive podcast that I do once or twice a month, depending on what I'm able to get accomplished, especially over the course of this crazy, crazy busy summer. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.